Once upon a time, Premier League midfields were dominated by box-to-box warriors. The most infamous and revered were Patrick Vieira and Roy Keane. This is the story of how a skinny winger playing in France and a forgotten Brazilian World Cup winner who never even played in England replaced those box-to-box warriors and redefined how we think about midfielders entirely. This is the untold story of Claude Makéléle. Chapter 1. The Fall of the Giants. To start the story, we have to go back to 2003. Man United and Arsenal dominated the Premier League, and their matches were characterised as battles between two men, Vieira and Keane. But in life, everything changes. And before long, both Vieira and Keane ceased to be the model for Premier League midfielders. Two reasons. First, they got older, and they simply couldn't get up and down the pitch like they used to. And second, neither were quite capable of switching to a pure holding role, which is slightly surprising. Wenger assessed that Vieira couldn't do it, and sold him, and according to Michael Cox, Ferguson believed his fallout with Keane stemmed from asking the Irishman to play a more restricted role. So, they got old. But the second reason they stopped becoming the model for Premier League midfielders was more structural. After Mourinho arrived in the Premier League, managers started using three in midfield. That meant there was less need for a box-to-box midfield player, and instead an increased need for specialised defensive positions, for someone who wouldn't budge in front of the defence. So, by 2003, the box-to-box midfield giants were on their last legs. Chapter 2. The winger who lost his wings. Before Vieira and Keane had reached their prime, a skinny winger renowned for salamming past opposition challengers called Macaulay won Liga 1 in 1995. Far from being the defensive midfield player that everyone remembers him as, he was an attacking player, all about energy rather than positional discipline. Remember Ramirez? Well, the skinny winger developed into a right-hand sided midfield player in a 4-1-2-1-2, just as Ramirez later would for Chelsea. But then everything changed. He moved to Spanish side Celta Vigo, and here he meets the hero of the piece, an ageing midfielder called Mazinho, a World Cup winner, and someone who inadvertently changed the Premier League forever. When people talk about the Macaulay role, Mazinho is almost never mentioned. But if there's no Mazinho, there's likely no Macaulay role. Together at Celta Vigo, they played as a deep midfield too. He trained Macaulay in the art of playing in the new, deeper role. According to Macaulay, Mazinho opened up the spirit of the new role. I spent hours working with him explaining the correct positions to take up, and how to play 1 and 2 touches. Even at this stage in the story though, Macaulay was still an attacking player as well as a defensive one. Celta Vigo had a remarkable Champions League campaign, where they beat both Benfica 7-0 and Juventus 4-0. He scored in both, including a goal after just 27 seconds against Juventus, and he was clearly not yet a pure holding midfield player. And at this stage, our hero moves to Real Madrid, alongside his Celta Vigo midfield partner, Celades, who had replaced the ageing Mazinho. At this stage of the story, there's a misconception. The common idea is that Macaulay was the sole defensive midfielder, holding together all the attacking stars of Real Madrid. But in 76 of his 95 league starts, he played alongside another disciplined defensive midfielder, and only 17 times out of those 95 was he the only one playing the role. It was only now in 2003 when he left to Chelsea that Real Madrid's obsession with superstars spiraled out of control, according to Michael Cox in The Mixer. The villain in the piece, Real Madrid president Florentino Perez, was hugely disparaging of Macaulay. He said, his technique is average, he lacks the speed and skill to take the ball past opponents, and 90% of his distribution either goes backwards or sideways. He couldn't header the ball and couldn't pass it more than 3 meters. But this is really interesting, because he wasn't actually describing Macaulay's skill set. Back in France, Macaulay was known as an all-rounder. Instead, he was describing a role, the role that was later going to change modern football. Chapter 3. The Macaulay role. When Macaulay signed for Chelsea, he was already 30 years old and played a full 11 seasons of top-flight football, and he still wasn't the player everyone remembers him as. Just before he signed, Brian Clough said the following about Chelsea's summer spending. I'd love to know who's going to do all the fetching and carrying for these glamorous, overpriced internationals, who love to bomb forward, yet can't tackle their dinner. Never mind a ball. Cole and Duff won't get their hands dirty doing the donkey work. The answer was Macaulay. He played so deep in the 4-4-2 against Middlesbrough that some newspapers described it as a 4-1-1-2-2, with Macaulay sitting in front of the defence and allowing Lampard to break forward. Enter Jose Mourinho. Unlike at Real Madrid, Chelsea's Jose Mourinho were a defensive side who got numbers behind the ball. Macauley's role, therefore, was not to be the only defensive resource. Instead, his role was to play a unique positional game. As Jose said, if I have a triangle in midfield, with Claude Makéléle behind the other two just in front, I will always have an advantage against a pure 4-4-2, where the central midfielders are side by side. That's because I can always have the extra man between the lines. There's nothing that a pure 4-4-2 can do to stop it. And this is where people get Makéléle wrong. Saatchi, the great champion of universality, according to Michael Cox, said, "In my football, the playmaker was whoever had the ball. But Makéléle can't do that. He doesn't have the ideas to do it, although he's great at winning the ball." But this actually underestimated Makéléle. What was unique about him was not that he was so good at defending, but rather it was his unique positioning combined with quite how well-rounded he was. So much so that Chris Coleman, to my knowledge, became the first Premier League manager to use a number 10 to mark a defensive midfield player out of the game. Typically, the reverse is true. But in 2006, he played Steve Malbranque to sit on Makéléle, saying, "Every time you play against Chelsea, everything goes through Makéléle and he starts the attacks. We wanted Petr Cech to kick it rather than pass it, and it worked very well. So well, in fact, that Jose Mourinho made the earliest double substitution in Premier League history and changed to a 3 at the back in the second half. Two big changes, almost exclusively because Fulham had successfully stopped Makéléle. And in that moment, the Makéléle role had been invented." Chapter 4. Legacy. Midfields were never the same. Macaléle's ability on the ball, combined with his unique positioning, led to other Premier League sides attempting to replicate him. According to Les Ferdinand, what we've now done is produce a crop of players who don't want to go over the halfway line, who don't want to pass the ball, and are happy to just sit in front of the back four. And while this was badly received by the press and other footballers, he's right in one sense of the term. The type of midfield player the Premier League clubs looked for changed, and if you want evidence, you just need to look at Lucas Leiva, Anderson, and John Obi Mikel. All three were precocious midfield players who loved going forward, with Anderson being described as having an inexhaustible box of tricks. But he was converted to a deeper position that, quote, no coach in his native land would have considered for a nanosecond. Lucas at Liverpool was the very same. Voted the best player in the Brazilian Championship and a winner of the South American Under-20s Championship, he scored 4 goals in 9 games. 5 years previously, he'd have been considered a box-to-box midfield player, not an exclusively holding player whose job it was primarily to gain a positional advantage for his side as well as covering in behind. And in some ways, we've never gone back. Midfield players that play exclusively in a 2, such as James Ward-Prowse, haven't got England call-ups as the game has become more specialised. Box-to-box midfield players have become rarer and rarer, with players like James Ward-Prowse not getting into the side because where would they fit? They're not quite defensive midfield players, and they're not quite enough of a 10 to justify playing that role. Hence, some of the excitement about Jude Bellingham, a young player who seems to be truly box-to-box. Makelele, despite only playing the role for the first time in pure terms at 30, changed English football forever, all despite being a skinny winger in France just 10 years prior. That's the story of Makelele. Thank you for watching.